Welcome to Broadband Breakfast live online for Wednesday, July 26th, 2023. I'm Drew Clark. I'm editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast, coming to you live from Capitol Hill, where Congress is still in session for just a short time before they split out and not to be seen for some time. It's an exciting time in broadband, believe it or not, even though we're coming on August. There's very significant conferences. There's the Fiber Connect conference that's happening in a week and a half in Denver. There is, did I say Fiber Connect? Mountain Connect happening. And then there's Fiber Connect 2 weeks after that in Florida. Of course, a joy to go to Orlando, Florida in the middle of August, but be that as it may, it's going to be an important event. As you all know, I hope we're hoping to have a great turnout for this. We stream our webcasts on YouTube, Twitter, I should say X now, on Facebook and LinkedIn. And of course, many of you watch us directly on Broadband Breakfast or on this Zoom cast where you can ask comments. And in fact, you can interact on all of the platforms. So feel free to ask questions wherever you are. We are a community. We want to foster community. In fact, we've been doing Broadband Breakfast Live online since since March of 2020, when the pandemic began. And this program was a way to bring this community together to talk about the vital importance of broadband, making sure that we share information, resources, and knowledge about the policy questions and about the way we get better broadband, better lives. That's our motto here at Broadband Breakfast. We do this every week. We've got exciting programs coming up in the next few weeks. For example, next week, we're going to have a show on the future of rip and replace. The week following, we'll be live from Mountain Connect. I'll be in Denver. Then 2 weeks later in Orlando, Florida. And then we'll be talking about remote education, online learning. And then we'll be previewing the BEAD Implementation Summit. The BEAD Implementation Summit is one of our in-person events. We've just recently come off of the Made in America Summit, which we had here in Washington at the Samsung Executive Center. And we talked about infrastructure, but also about domestic chip production and green energy. So it's a little more comprehensive view. With the BEAD Implementation Summit, we're going to be drilling down. June 26th was the NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration's announcement of funding amounts that each of the 50 states and 5 territories and District of Columbia will receive as part of the BEAD program. And in the BEAD Implementation Summit on September 21st here in Washington, we're going to be talking at great length about the role of the state broadband officers, about the role of prior programs like the American Rescue Plan Act and the capital projects funds that's part of that, as well as CAF2 and RDOF, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. And then we're going to be delving into financing, the vital role of matching funds, as well as the controversies, Buy America and many other controversies around the BEAD implementation. We are very happy to welcome sponsors. In fact, joining us for this event will be Lehrman Center and CostQuest, and invite you to learn more about the BEAD Implementation Summit by going to broadbandbreakfast.com/BIS for BEAD Implementation Summit. Registration is early bird registration available now until August 21st for $145. So encourage you to sign up for that now. These programs every Wednesday are free programming we do because we receive support from sponsors, including Utopia Fiber, Broadband.money, Comcast, Nokia, BroadbandToolkit.com, the Comlaw Group, Google Fiber, Broadband Now, Michael Baker International, and Positron Access. Thanks to our sponsors that make our programming possible. And with that, let's go ahead and open it up to our panel, because we have a great group of people. Make sure I hide the non-video participants. And of course, if you are not a panelist, please don't turn your video on and keep yourself muted. So I'm going to give a quick intro of each of our four panelists. I might say, we do this every week, so that's 52 Wednesdays a year. And you have to put out like 3 to 4 invitations per person. So we don't always get the right balance, and I've already apologized to Steve. We didn't mean this to be a 3-to-1 contest here, but I'm sure you can pull it off, Steve. And quite frankly, most of our events end up finding a lot of consensus. So that's what I would be interested in, is what consensus, what can Steve and Sasha agree on? That will be a real test for me. And I don't know whether it's a very small amount or a lot, but that will be what I'm listening for today. So here's who we're going to be hearing from. We're going to start off by hearing from Josh Steger. Josh is the policy director at Free Press. And at Free Press, he advances policies to close the digital divide, protect consumers, make the broadband market competitive. Oh my gosh, that's so important. I'm so glad to see that in your bio, and make and affordable. And he works closely with industry, Congress, the FCC, and other regulatory agencies. Previously, he was deputy director of the Open Technology Institute, which he shares with, an affiliation he shares with Sasha, and we're going to hear more about that in just a second. But Josh has been super, super close in following this. So we're going to start with him as soon as I introduce the other panelists, to kick us off on where the state of this nutrition label, so-called nutrition label, is right now. Josh will be followed by Steve Curran. Steve is the chair of Lehrman Center's Broadband Spectrum and Communications Infrastructure Practice Group. And Steve represents broadband providers, private equity firms, equipment and technology companies, as well as new technology firms in their policy, transactional, compliance, and licensing needs. He's very active in representing trade associations before the FCC. We'll let you talk more about that, Steve, and before the FCC, Congress, and other federal agencies. And anyway, he's just all around mensch. Just great to have you with us, Steve, and to give your perspective on these issues here. So following Steve, we're going to hear from Ryan Johnson. Ryan is responsible for Next Century Cities' federal policy portfolio, building and maintaining relationships with the agencies, Congress, and public interest allies. And he's been very interested in following this: digital divide, broadband mapping, benchmark speeds, spectrum policy, content moderation, privacy, and more. Thank you, Ryan, for being part of this discussion. You're first on Broadband Breakfast Live Online. And adding cleanup will be Sasha. I last minute addition to the panel, so I don't have the whole bio, but in some ways he needs no introduction. He's the Palmer Chair in Telecommunications at Penn State University, the founder of XLab, and I think also the founder of Open Technology Institute. Isn't that right, Sasha?
Correct. Yep.
So we're going to hear after the others from Sasha, who will add his perspective to this issue and what we can make of the labels and how it fits into some of the other broadband policy issues. Okay, so let's turn it over to you, Josh, to give us the lay of the land for about 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Sure. Well, thanks so much, Drew, and thanks for hosting this important conversation. So the broadband nutrition label is a pretty straightforward idea. It is a standardized disclosure of the basic costs and terms of internet service plans, modeled after the familiar nutrition labels that the FDA puts out on food products since the 1980s. It's largely in response to a lot of opaque and misleading internet bills that plenty of consumers are familiar with, whether it's trying to figure out something that's buried in the fine print or identifying junk fees. A lot of consumers have struggled for years to just decipher what's going on in their broadband bill and determine especially the total all-in cost of service. So even though this label is a very straightforward idea, it's actually taken us many years to get to this point. The label was first proposed in 2009 by Sasha and OTI. And in 2015, the FCC endorsed the idea, making it a part of the 2015 Open Internet Order, where using this label would have been a voluntary safe harbor for those transparency rules. So the Consumer Advisory Committee formed and created this label in 2016. But again, the label was voluntary. So it remained to be seen what providers would take it on and how it would develop. But it never really got off the ground, because then the Trump administration came in and that FCC repealed the open internet order, and with it, some of the need for the safe harbor on the label. But the idea of the label and the need for pricing transparency never really went away. And in about 2 years ago, President Biden endorsed the idea in his executive order on competition. And Congress passed a law, and part of the infrastructure law, requiring that this label be revived, and importantly, revived in a mandatory way. So now what we have is a label required in federal law. It's not part of any open internet order or net neutrality regime. It's just a pro-consumer transparency measure that was part of the infrastructure money and the BEAD money and all of these programs that we got in that law. So after that law was passed, it kicked it over to the FCC for the implementation period that we have been in for the past year and a half. So we have a model for the label that's been published and an initial order. And hopefully it's in some of the final regulatory review phases. So hopefully we will be seeing it come out to the public later this year or early next year. But that's a quick overview of the long and winding decade-plus road it has taken to get to this point.
Okay, thanks, Josh. I think I'm up next, and thank you.
Go ahead, Steve. Go for it.
Yep, I'm on. So thanks again, Drew, for having me here. I'm going to be talking about the role of small providers and the impact of the broadband label rules and some of the rules that have been proposed and the burdens that have been placed on small providers. As Josh said, the rules have taken a long time to get where they are, and they're in response to allegations that some providers, and I'm going to say larger providers, were taking advantage of consumers. I can't prove that, but I would certainly say that has drawn some attention, and that's what the rules that the FCC put in place were more or less intended to address. Let me give you a little bit about WISPA, which is the Wireless ISP Association, aka WISPA Broadband Without Boundaries. 600 operator members within the organization, the vast majority of which are small businesses with 25 or fewer employees. All but a handful have less than 100,000 subs. And when I say a handful, I mean literally a handful, probably 2 or 3. And likewise, only a handful have in-house counsel. I could again count those on one hand. And WISPA's one of WISPA's policy priorities is always to focus on ensuring against the imposition of disproportionate burdens on small business members that don't have the resources that larger companies do. So with that background, let me kind of talk a little bit about kind of the 3 things that I think we're going to be talking about here. The first is the report and order. What's in the rules that the FCC adopted in November of 2022. And I would say from WISPA's perspective, the FCC got it pretty close to right. They created a balanced outcome with clear, easy, concise, understand components of the label that will promote transparency. We'll talk a little bit more about that, I'm sure, as we get going here, but that's our take on the November 17, 2022 order. That same day, the FCC also issued a further notice of proposed rulemaking in which it said, all right, we've adopted these rules. What are some other things that we should be thinking about and considering? And I would say that WISPA and other small providers have said, FCC, we think you're going too far if you adopt these additional proposals. And again, we can talk about the specifics of that as we roll into the panel. The third aspect is one that Josh alluded to, and that's that any information collection needs to be approved by the Office of Management and Budget under something that's actually called the Paperwork Reduction Act of 1988. It actually creates paper, not eliminates it, but it does require federal agencies to examine the burdens that are placed on small businesses. Earlier this year, WISPA and NTCA, which represents the telecom cooperatives, filed comments in response to the notice that OMB and the FCC put out estimating the burdens. And just yesterday, OMB or the Federal Register published a revised set of burdens associated with implementation of the broadband label, and is seeking comment on later this month on August the 24th. They've estimated the burdens, just so folks know, of 30 minutes to 9 hours annually. That was in the first set, and 0 cost. The second set, based on our advocacy, I'd like to say, said it's anywhere from 1.5 hours up to 65 hours. So they've gone from 9 to 65 on the top end based on what it would require to implement the broadband label. And so the notice specifically asked for comments on the small business, on the impact of these rules on small businesses. So I'll stop there, and Ryan, I think you're up next.
Yeah. So thank you, Drew, for having me. It's great to be here for the first time, and hopefully many more to come. But a little bit about Next Century Cities First. We are a nonprofit that works with mainly municipal governments. So towns, counties, villages, you name it, we work with those folks. And we have members that range anywhere from places like LA County to East Liverpool, Ohio. So we have a very large range of, the biggest of cities to the smallest of towns. And one of the biggest things that we're kind of currently working on is listening to our members and saying, how would the label affect the consumers that are in your communities? Because this is really supposed to be a consumer-focused transparency tool. It's supposed to give them the tools that they need to do their comparison shopping, or to do their to hold their ISPs accountable if they do find that something is being if they're being misled in some way or some form or another. And so as we've been looking at things, the things that we've been hearing being reiterated time and time again are really that, like, the information that's going to be included in the label is not necessarily going to be as comprehensive as it needs to be. So back before the FCC put out its first report and order and the further notice of proposed rulemaking, they had the Consumer Advisory Committee put together a recommendation for what the label should contain. Next Century Cities sat on the Consumer Advisory Committee at that time, and what the committee ended up putting out or recommending was that, on speeds, it'd be this thing that they called the typical speed. And that is a term that kind of originated back in 2011 from one of the old modernization orders. But what it does is it allows providers to provide like a range of speeds that a consumer might see. It doesn't give a lot of certainty as to what exactly a consumer is going to receive. So in some instances, it's actually even more ethereal than what the maximum advertised speed is. So we're looking at some of these things saying, like, okay, well, now we have a range of speeds. You could get any of these in between the slowest and the fastest, depending on what time it is. So we can't really tell you exactly what you're going to receive. Something like an average speed that's taken over the course of a month or 2 months or a year or something like that would provide a much clearer view of what a consumer is actually going to receive. But then also things that kind of got left out of the label that consumers are really interested in are things like their promotional pricings. What are they going to get if they sign up now? How long is that promotion going to last? What is their bill going to look like after that promotion happens? Right now, all the consumer gets is what their bill will look like after a promotion ends. And one of the big things that both the White House and the FCC said at the start of this process is that they want to eliminate bill shock. They want to make sure that folks aren't concerned when all of a sudden their bill goes up, a year, 2 years into their subscription. But if all they have is what they're going to be paying later, when that goes up, it still doesn't eliminate that, because sure, they might know it down the line, but when's the last time anybody's actually looked at their bill? We held the congressional briefing last week where we had a an official from Austin, Texas, actually talk about how like everything is just on auto pay and whatnot at this point. So if you just see a charge for twice the amount, you're going to be really concerned, even though you technically were supposed to know that that's what you were supposed to be paying. But so the bill shock piece there doesn't really actually get ameliorated simply because you're looking 2 years into the future, but you don't know what you're supposed to be paying now. And the last piece I'll touch on before I turn it over to Sasha is the state and local taxes. Again, this nutrition label was touted as something that was supposed to give the consumer like an all-in price. Like, this is what you're going to be paying at the end of the month. And there has been this massive fight over preventing things like discounts and state and local taxes from being included in that label, which at the end of the day, those things do make up a significant amount of your bill. And so refusing to include those things doesn't give someone that all-in price. So naturally their bill will be higher than what the label says it will be. And therefore we're not actually meeting the transparency level that we originally set out to do at the beginning of this process way back in 2016. So I'll stop there and I'll turn it over to Sasha.
Great, lots of great stuff we're setting the table. Go ahead, Sasha.
Sure. So it's hard to know where to start thinking about this since we've been sort of involved, me and my team have been involved in this since the very beginning. But let me start with kind of original intent, because I think that's really important. When I came to DC first in 2007, I'd already been building internet service providing networks for almost a decade at that point in time. I've been building out community broadband networks for about 25 years now. And over the course of building these systems, learned a lot about kind of best practices, what works, what doesn't work, and the fact that the incumbents were often lying about what was available and what the actual costs of those services were. So when we created the Open Technology Institute in 2008 and in 2009, we were originally attacking two different problems. And I want to give a shout out to Rob Topolsky, Dan Meredith, Ben Lennett. Those three individuals, myself, we created the original idea of the broadband nutrition label. And it came out of a brainstorm where we're like, okay, let's draw from what we know about actually implementing, building service providers and put it into the best practice of what they should disclose to their users. And if you look at the original broadband nutrition label as proposed, it started with the idea of mandatory minimums, the idea of a customer knowing at a minimum, I'm getting this. Was very important to us. We were approaching this from sort of the consumer advocacy side, and we were approaching it from, well, what does it make sense for a provider to disclose? And I'm heartened to see Brett Glass say, like, yeah, we guarantee minimums. I'm like, yeah, that's the way it should be. Well, that's not what the FCC has actually implemented. And more importantly, we've sort of gotten away from reality across a number of domains at the FCC. So we proposed this nutrition label in 2009. And we propose that the FCC crowdsource collect data, real world information about what people were actually receiving in their homes, and created the measurement lab platform as a prototype because the FCC in 2009 and 2010 said it couldn't be done. You couldn't do crowdsourced data collection. It was impossible. And so we created the measurement lab, we created the nutrition label as mechanisms in order to empower consumers. And now, fast forward 15 years, and through all the vagaries of all these various and sundry battles, we still very much have this officialdom problem with reality. So we've created new and improved maps, which are more precise, but just as inaccurate. We have broadband nutrition labels that don't talk at all about the realities of, well, what is it that I'm actually buying when I purchase service? And we also have this problem of people being charged all these extraneous fees and add-ons and all this other stuff. When we did with Consumer Reports, this Broadband Together initiative a couple of years ago, we collected 50,000 bills, the actual bills that people had from all across the country. And we found that for the same tier of service, neighbors on the same street were often paying differentials of 40%. And this points to a business model, in essence, of de facto, not everyone, but a lot of ISPs, especially the bigger ones, ripping off consumers, adding in ancillary fees, made up fees to their service packages. So when you get today, like when you get a offer, you know, like my speed isn't actually the speed I'm going to get. The price isn't exactly the price that I'm going to pay. So I'm like, what is the purpose of all this? Which goes back to original intent. The original intent of the broadband nutrition label was to empower me, the individual consumer, to make a more informed decision about what provider do I want to go with. And I know this assumes a competitive market space, which we all know is laughably not the case across much of America. But at least I would know, what is it that I'm paying for? What is it I'm buying? And how much is my total all-in cost? And in that regard, the broadband nutrition labels are a good step forward. But as several of the other panelists have pointed out, they are fraught with a number of shortcomings that still need to be addressed. So I'm 15 years into this battle already. I think I've got a few more years before I shunt off this mortal coil, and damn it, I'm going to continue to fight to ensure that we have meaningful information, not just at point of sale, but in the public domain, so that I can make informed decisions about what services, which providers will offer me the best service for the best price.
So, Sasha, let me use what you've said and the others have said to start off with diving into the issue of linking up the maps with the speeds and the nutrition labels. As you know, from collaboration and interaction in January 2008, broadband census launched, and we talked a lot about the spark, the role of broadband speeds, prices, availability, reliability, and competition. And of course, used NDT as a internet speed test. Measurement Lab, of course, has done an incredible job in collecting and making publicly available millions, maybe billions, I don't know right now.
Yeah, billions now.
billions of speed tests. And what the speed tests go to is a massive extent of not delivering the promised speed. Now, again, I'm not trying to cast aspersions. I'm not saying that it's lying. Maybe others want to say that, but the simple fact is that because we are letting providers say we offer speeds up to X, we have vastly overcounted the number of served, or I should say, we've undercounted the number of unserved and underserved people because they're simply not getting those speeds and those qualities. So with that point, the question is, should the nutrition label be a little more conscious and interact a little bit more with the broadband data process that the FCC has done, is still doing? The NTIA has built its distribution of funds under the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program based on this FCC map. So let's just open up to all of our panelists, talk about the way speeds and measurements and nutrition, reliability needs to factor into this bipartisan infrastructure build out. Let's go in the same order we started with. Josh.
Sure. I mean, I think it's an exciting question, and it's great that we're at the point that we can even talk about that, right? I mean, for many years, nobody wanted to talk about the maps. Nobody wanted to talk about any of this. And we're finally at the point where, we have the fabric, we have some, albeit flawed version of the maps out. Although there's a lot of pressure, right, with these maps just to simply get them working for the BEAD program. And same with these nutrition labels. These kind of came out a few years after the Broadband Data Act. And the FCC has been, I think, carrying a lot to try to implement both of these things on a pretty quick timeline after many years of the data on both of these fronts being a huge problem. Absolutely, speed and reliability, it's a really important part of the label. I think it is something that is going to be iterative no matter how this shakes out. It's going to have to be improved and refined. I would love to see on the pricing side, that somehow incorporated into the mapping, because we still have no, really meaningful pricing data collection at the commission or elsewhere. And I think that's a huge, huge part that's, currently not reflected in the maps, but has to be, right? Even if you're talking about the implementation of BEAD, if BEAD manages to, build to every unserved community, but the service on those networks is unaffordable, then I don't think the program will have done its job. So I would actually love to see the pricing element of the label incorporated into the maps. But I say that, with full recognition that that's a tall order at this point. We're still just trying to get the maps itself useful for its initial purposes.
Steve, are we being unfair? Am I being unfair? To give us your reaction to this question of measuring reliable speeds.
So a couple things on that. I point out that every year the FCC conducts an urban rate survey that it uses it collects data from ISPs around the country and uses that data to set benchmark rates for voice and broadband at various speed tiers for recipients of high cost support. So the FCC does have that data. Second, the FCC can collect pricing data from the current open internet disclosure rules. It just has chosen not to. It's also collecting information through its Affordable Connectivity Program. So there are these data sources out there. And some of it, I believe the ACP will be published. I know the Urban Rate Survey is published every year and is used to set rates for those receiving high cost support in the following year. And that's to make sure that rates are not too high for those that agree to accept high cost support from the FCC. And those recipients are also required to speed test and to test for latency. And they have to be within certain benchmarks, 80% on their upload and download speed requirements, and 95% of the 100 millisecond latency requirement. And there is rigorous testing every quarter that's required to be reported to the FCC. So if you don't meet those, there are, and this is very important, there are enforcement mechanisms that the FCC has in place, just as there will be for those who do not adequately complete their broadband label or report information on their broadband label that is false. And I think we all deserve to give ourselves and providers and the regulator an opportunity to see how these rules work and to see how folks comparison shop and to test the reliability of the information to see if there is really a problem here that we're trying to fix. I know some have pointed to the fact that, back in 2012, Comcast got socked with an $800,000 fine for hiding information about its pricing. Well, that's one instance that we all know about over the last 12 years. So that, to me, says two things. One, it's not a rampant problem, and two, the enforcement mechanisms work. So I guess that would be, my message here is, let's see how things work out. Let's see how the enforcement mechanisms work. There is accountability built into the system. And if there's a problem that we need to fix, we'll fix it.
Brian.
Yeah. The really big piece on our end is that I'm very interested to see how all of these things fit together, because we know through the BEAD program that there is a low-cost plan and a middle-class affordability plan that are supposed to be built into the BEAD program for the folks that are looking to do build-outs. So I'm very interested to see what data collection comes from how the states decide to design those plans and how those are implemented down the road. I think that is a really good opportunity to say, okay, here is at least a little bit of good pricing data that we have that's fresh. But when we look at something like the Affordable Connectivity Program's transparency data collection, the FCC has chosen to collect that data at an aggregate level, meaning that we're not really going to get good household level data that determines what plans people are actually subscribing to, what those plans cost, what people are paying in excess of the $30 that they're getting from the ACP. So we're really at a point where, without a mandate from the FCC or from Congress really to get good, accurate pricing data, we've kind of just, or the FCC has kind of just chosen to not go down that road. And that's something that, you know, third parties, so the community-based organizations, a lot of nonprofits and municipal governments have been trying very hard to do to make up for that gap, to close that gap, I should say, to make sure that their state has good operating data when they're submitting their BEAD initial proposals and their 5-year action plans. But those are certainly, you know, cost-intensive things that a lot of these organizations cannot do long-term. So we might get a really quick snapshot, but that doesn't mean that we're going to have really good data moving forward into a lot of the programs that actually need this data to make good informed decisions.
Tasha, what would you add to this?
Yeah, so I want to underscore several of the points that folks raised, and particularly what Steve was saying about there are these enforcement mechanisms. The FCC is a remarkably powerful agency that chooses systematically to forego enforcement in the face of overwhelming evidence that something is awry, right? So when I say like,
compare robocall enforcement to speed and reliability enforcement, right?
Exactly. I mean, and you know, this goes across the board. It's really remarkable to me that it's such an obvious fact that there is discriminatory pricing and that there is predatory pricing. The only question in broadband service provision is whether those standard practices rise to the level of being illegal or discriminatorily so against protected groups. So into that fact, you would think somebody would say, hey, we should collect the information to ensure that this isn't like standard business practices by major providers to illegally discriminate in their pricing structures. And the FCC consistently refuses to collect the kind of information that would exonerate ISPs or condemn them. So on the one hand, you have two kinds of people in this world. Those that say like, there's something malfeasant going on. We should collect the data to see if that is in fact the case. And there are those that say, there is nothing untoward going on, but don't collect any information to exonerate us. Mm-hmm. And into that space, I say like, look, if the concern is like, why does America pay so much for our telecommunications service? So when we created the cost of connectivity report, we were still being told the high prices of American telecommunications don't exist. And so we collected data on a global scale. And we're like, nope, they actually do. When we started collecting information that people were not receiving the speeds that they were paying for, we were told that problem doesn't exist. Today, when we say, hey, look, it looks like people are getting these ancillary fees for no reason by various ISPs, we're told, well, that doesn't happen. And systematically, time and time and time and time again, that which we're told is not happening is in fact happening, all to the detriment of consumers. And into that space, I feel like we get to see then, this is what the regulatory capture, this is what American corruption looks like. It's an agency that is tasked explicitly to operate in the best interest of consumers, and systematically, when it comes to telecommunications service provisioning, has failed to do so.
So I asked for questions. We've gotten questions, obviously very active chat. I've distilled about a half a dozen, 8 questions here. But first, let me give Steve a chance to reply here on this point here. What do you think, not necessarily just Sasha, but just in general, what do you think about this argument that there isn't enough enforcement, or there should be more enforcement of claims of speed by internet service providers?
So I don't know whether that claim is true or false. What I do know is that there are public interest groups, 2 of which are represented here, that could certainly provide that information to the FCC, and the FCC could, if it chose to, enforce. I would also say, and I've heard this anecdotally, I'm not a technologist and I'm not an ISP, so I don't know this, is that some of the speed testing is not really accurate. And it suffers from, what are you measuring from? What is your point A? What is your point B? The FCC went through a very kind of long process in deciding what the speed testing and latency testing formats should be for those who accept support. And it's going to be the same regime that we're going to have for the BEAD program.
Right.
And there are costs associated with that. And the costs can be offset with the government subsidies or the government grants. For those that do not take government subsidies, however, we really need to pay attention to the costs that are imposed, especially on small businesses.
Right.
And I think that needs to be a component of the discussion.
So sort of bringing in this discussion here about burdensome compliance, and I hear what you're saying, particularly when we're talking about small ISPs. In some ways, the question is how we get to this system that is continually providing information. I think Christine Hallquist has a great comment and then a question later on about how, from the perspective of the consumer, I'd like to see the requirement around max available. Oh, sorry, this is not her point. Yeah, here it is. The technology has the ability to monitor address level performance 24/7. We should require telecom companies to produce reports on their real-time performance and their address level, rounded up to overall company performance, lost hours, average latency, report it monthly, put it on their websites. Great question, great kind of comment. Let's get everyone's reaction. What are the kind of pros and cons of that kind of a requirement for monitoring? Let's same order, Josh, or unless people want to weigh in quicker.
I think Sasha wants to jump in here.
Yeah, so, and again, we've developed a number of open source tools that will allow people to do exactly that. So if you go to Radar Toolkit, there's a whole suite of tools that will do that. We have been begging the FCC to do this for 15 years, right? So it is a known problem. It has a variety of known solutions. I like to belt and suspenders things. So I'm like, I'm going to run a product that's going to run like Ookla test and MLab test and like any test I can get my hands on, because I want the panoply of data inputs. And what we have found, again, systematically, is that people are paying for services that they just don't achieve. So we're about to release a map for all of Pennsylvania that's looking at millions of tests just from our state and mashing that up with what people supposedly are receiving in these spaces. And what we find is throughout vast swaths of the state, spanning millions of tests, there's huge portions of the state where the fastest speed test ever in that region does not even approach what we are told exists. And into that space, I'm like, I don't understand. Like, we've collected at times tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of speed tests, and none of them have ever been as fast as the ISPs are claiming exist in this location.
But wait, so isn't there the fact that there are lots of other factors that can slow down a speed test, including, the Wi-Fi in a home? I mean, many hops on networks. Is that a true representation? And I'm sure ISPs will make this point.
Correct. No, all of that is absolutely valid. Those are artifacts that affect your overall speed. My point is, if nobody has ever, in all of the speed tests that have been run, come within 50%, 20%. We've been actually looking at data where we're looking to see, has the fastest speed test achieved 10% of the claimed top tier? And the answer is, in portions of the state, the answer is no. This isn't even close. This is like, and again, if we were honest with ourselves, what we would realize is that the claimed speeds are not what people are able to actually receive. And yes, there are all these artifacts, but we miss the forest for the trees.
All right,
let's say, like, these artifacts say they could affect an individual speed test. And I'm saying, look, we looked at 11 million speed tests. None of them seem to achieve this 10 gig speed that is apparently available in these various locations.
we have some threads here in the comments about minimum and maximum speeds, right? And so here we have an ISP. Brett Glass has made the point that what is an honest small ISP to do when competitors are exaggerating and the label doesn't fit his particular business model or service plan. And I think this is kind of going to, we're going to provide it, even if it isn't, we're not going to exaggerate what we provide, but we're going to deliver what we provide. So let's ask a question of everyone on, is there a relevance to having like a minimum and a maximum, or maybe like a 10th percentile? Let's talk a little bit specifically about what the label is requiring, and are there ways to kind of, make the label better?
So I'll jump in here. Again, I said at the outset that I thought the FCC got a lot of things right. And one of the things that they did get right is requiring ISPs to report their typical speed for each of the tiers that they offer. It's important to understand that you need a label for each of the service tiers that you offer to consumers. So if you think about it, why would average be better? Well, it wouldn't be better because average could be, what time period are you measuring that over? When are you doing the testing? How do you determine what the average is? And the average doesn't correspond to what you're going to get on a typical basis. And I think if the FCC goes, and it gave some suggestions on how an ISP could measure what their typical speed is. I think if we don't give the market an opportunity to respond in a way that is acceptable to consumers, then we are having heavy-handed regulation for a problem that may or may not exist. And, we get back to the old classic antitrust argument is, what should the government require versus what can the market govern? And I think that kind of overhangs all of these discussions. And I think, as I said at the top, what the FCC got right is the things that Congress required them to implement. Some of the other things we're talking about are things that could be controlled by the market and by best practices and by the desire of competitors to provide information above and beyond what the label requires to attract customers away from their competitors. And so I think it's important to kind of frame some of the discussion in those terms.
Has the FCC made any determination about minimum or 10th percentile or average or median speeds?
It did not adopt those in the initial order, but the notion about should we go further in how we require ISPs to report speeds is teed up in the further notes.
Can I jump in here just to respond to a couple of those points? I think Steve made some important points here on small providers, especially. So it's what's, one of the fascinating things I think in the implementation process here is that several small providers have stepped up to show that they're actually already trying to compete on pricing transparency, that like the transparency and the complexity of the pricing in this market is so bad that this is actually something that some providers have found that they can attract new customers based on. So there are some very small providers that have already been doing things akin to an attrition label to demonstrate, look, this is all in pricing. We don't have ancillary fees. You don't have to dig through fine print to figure out what our service plans are. So I think that supports what Steve was saying earlier about a lot of small providers being able to comply with this label more easily than some of the biggest ones. So that some of the worst bills found in that consumer reports survey and many others come from the biggest providers. That's where the deep complexity is. So it's really interesting to see the way that many small providers have stepped up and already gone above and beyond to show that both they can do this easily, and that it's actually really good for business. The second point I'd make, though, is, in terms of letting the market respond to this, I agree. I want to see how that shakes out. But the bigger first order problem we have before getting into some of these other determinations around speed and latency is literally just making sure the average consumer will see this label. And that is something that we are still fighting. So the FCC declined to require that this label be put on the monthly bill for consumers. That is the most obvious place that someone's going to see this. So that is going to be the next big fight, I think, when we get this implemented, is just making sure that providers are not hiding this, that they're not only showing it at point of sale where someone can't find it. Because if consumers can't see the label, they can't look at that data, they're not going to be able to identify problems, complain about it, elevate it so that the market then can respond. We might see a lack of a market response simply because consumers don't even know the label exists. That basic display rule is something that we are still working on and still needs to be improved with this implementation.
Brian, what are your thoughts on the maximum and minimum question?
Yeah, so one of the things that, to one of the points that Sasha made back a while ago now, Pennsylvania is lucky to have him, because in a lot of states, they don't have a Sasha Meinrath that is able to go out and do a lot of the data collection work that he has been able to do. In some places, and in some of our member cities, they have been the tech office or their chief information office has been the ones that have been kind of trying to go out and do these, between the wall and the router, speed data collections. But again, it's completely funded by the city. Maybe they have a grant to do it. Maybe they got lucky and are using some of their state and local fiscal recovery fund money to do it. But it is really one of these things where they don't have a lot of resources to be able to go out and do this in the massive way that you would need to be able to do to provide a really good, clear picture of what what speeds actually look like for even a small to mid-sized community. To do a few thousand households in speed tests is a lot. So
Brian, isn't this something? What about the role of state broadband offices, right? And be interested as to, are you finding any receptivity from the state broadband office in Pennsylvania or other states? Because it would seem to me that this now group has an incredible amount of resources, and we have got many on the call on chiming in. Christine Hallquist, for example, in Vermont, spoke on an Ask Me Anything in the broadband community not long ago, and we talked a lot about the importance of fiber connections and how we're going to get fiber connections to lots of rural parts. Not saying there's not going to be any wireless, don't get me wrong, but that is a preference of the NTIA in deployment, and whether or not, or whatever technology is being deployed, the question is, they seem to be very well positioned to be an entity to be on top of these questions of speed, pricing, availability, reliability, competition. What do you think, Steve and Sasha and others?
Yeah, I'll start on that one, because one of the big things that we've been seeing is that even though a lot of states have their initial planning dollars from the BEAD program, a lot of states are still trying to kind of get their feet under them when it comes to figuring out how all of this stuff goes together. Not to throw Pennsylvania under the bus, but they just signed their contract with their consultant. I believe it was last month, correct me if I'm wrong, Sasha. But when we're looking at it, a lot of the folks that have their 5-year action plans due next month are still trying to figure out exactly what all of that needs to look like, so they make sure that they're not missing deadlines, so that they make sure that all of the information that they know they need to submit to the NTIA is nicely packaged so that they can get that approved. I think once we see those first volumes of the initial proposals being submitted, and they can unlock some of that, some more of that funding, then we'll really start to see them drill down on data collections. But at the same time, I think there's going to be a huge disparity between the states that have things like the Penn State extension that they can work with and other states that don't have those, because they'll then have to set up their own data collections by themselves in a way that might not necessarily be as comprehensive.
Let me kind of take this in a slightly different direction and, talk a little bit about the broadband data collection challenges, because I think that may be relevant here. And in discussing the quality of the data. And what I'm going to tell you is anecdotal based on some of the clients, individual ISPs I've worked with. And I can tell you that there were some, not all, state broadband offices that filed challenges that were, kind of related to fixed wireless that said, here's your tower, and we're going to draw a 5-mile circle around it. And if you have customers 8 miles out or 9 miles out, then you need to fight us. There were a couple of states that withdrew their challenges because when they were confronted with actual data that was presented by the provider, they said, you know what, we think you're right. There were others that said, you may be right, but we're going to let the regulator decide, and we're just going to hold everything in place. And yes, there were some instances that I heard of where they went out and did used a spectrum analyzer and had it pointed at somebody else's tower or in the wrong direction. Fixed wireless does have issues that are different than fiber, no question about it. The point of all this is, it's important to have quality data. And anytime you're doing testing or determining locations for a funding program, or determining pricing or determining speeds, and it's a very, very difficult nut to crack. I'm not gonna lie about it. And looking back at what the FCC did in the broadband labels order, they said, to determine typical upload and download speeds and latency, here's some of the things that you can use: actual performance based on internal testing, consumer speed test data, other data regarding network performance, including reliable, relevant data from third-party sources. So what if some of the organizations that may be represented here or in the audience here worked with, instead of against, some of their ISPs to develop good testing regimes and reasonable testing regimes and create some pilot programs? Might that be something that would be valuable to consumers and to our overall everybody's goal to have universal broadband?
This is kind of the interesting point where there might be some very good synergies between the 24/7 monitoring and providers, right? Because providers are very upset about having to fill out all these forms, the Form 477 forms. When I was the state broadband officer in Illinois, we kind of ran into this constantly, right? They don't want the requirements of it. And sometimes they are, but sometimes they're not opposed to, collecting and reporting of the speed, pricing, availability data, et cetera. So again, let's kind of maybe get everyone's comments as we gear towards the end about what would be a kind of a system for reporting, testing, open source of a lot of this information that not only is useful to regulators and consumers, but is also useful to providers so that they maybe don't have to spend that time doing that compliance. And let's maybe make this everyone's opportunity to chime in and offer any final thoughts. And let's go in the reverse order this time: Sasha, Ryan, Stephen, and Josh.
Sure. So let me start by saying, look, we're closing in now on $500 billion with a B, $500 billion on broadband mapping, public funds spent to create an array of dysfunctional, inaccurate, and imprecise maps over the past dozen years. It is Exhibit A for waste, fraud, and abuse. And it's, in essence, made all the more complicated because the FCC is trying to figure out, well, how do we collect? How do we create processes that collect and visualize inaccurate and imprecise data? And the reality is, for a lot of the independents, a lot of the small scale, a lot of the community-based ISPs, it would be so easy to just be like, here's our rate sheet. Like, we'll just give it to the FCC, no harm, no foul. It would take them no time whatsoever. For folks that have flat structures and simple pricing schemes, that's not an onerous task. But the FCC is trying to protect discriminatory pricing and all of these systems that engage in sort of this really bizarre array of different pricing structures by the large scale ISPs. And so they create an onerous process to protect those ISPs. And the collateral damage is the time from the small scale and independents. We see this time and time again, which is to say the FCC makes things more complicated in order to obfuscate, to hide from consumers, the general public, and public disclosure, kind of malfeasant business practices, most of which independent and smaller scale ISPs are not engaged in. And by doing that, creates these onerous processes for exactly the people that are not screwing around, the independents and the locally based.
Thank you, Sasha. Ryan, what are your thoughts on this? Is there some way that these worlds could converge and the regulatory and monitoring and testing could be a benefit to providers?
Sure. And I've got 2 points on this. The first one being that the FCC already has an outreach division that is supposed to be doing a lot of similar things to what we've been talking about today. So inside the Consumer Governmental Affairs Bureau sits the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs, and that is supposed to be their outreach division to states, to localities, to the folks that are working alongside these small regional providers, these local providers, these co-ops that Sasha is talking about. They have all of the pieces in place. They just need to make sure that they're utilizing them in a way that allows them to actually say, okay, how do we do this? How do we work with you to make sure that all of these things go well, make sure that we have all of the data that we need to make informed decisions? Like, those pieces exist. It's just that we need to make sure that we're using them. And then to kind of bring it back to the labels a little bit, Josh made the point about consumers actually getting the label. One of the things that came up in the further notice of proposed rulemaking was whether or not the FCC should require submission of those labels for, I guess, propositing. And that is absolutely something that the FCC should do, because right now at the point of sale, those labels are only available if you go to a brick and mortar store, if you already have an internet connection and are able to get online to look at the label while you're purchasing service, or on the phone, or at like a reseller or a kiosk or something like that. So once you leave your friend's house, or once you leave the brick and mortar store, you are cut off from the label. You can no longer use it because you can't, unless you print it out, you can't find it like in paper. You can't take it with you.
Right. Okay.
So ensuring that the FCC has those things that someone can then make sure that they go and have a central place that they can get them is absolutely crucial to making this label available to everyone.
Steve, what are your thoughts?
So, in fact, Sasha and I have agreed on something, and thank you very much for recognizing that, some of the things we've been talking about might create disproportionate burdens on those small providers that really do not have the resources to do some of the things that are teed up in the further notice, or some of the things that others may have advocated. So I think it's real important to pay attention to the costs. I think it's important to keep an eye on, is this bringing in investment or is it chilling investment if these costs get out of hand? These can't be absorbed just by an internal army of compliance folks. So I'll end the same way that we started, by just asking folks to keep an eye on that ball, and realize that there are hundreds of smaller companies serving the same rural areas that BEAD is intended to support, and for them to take on a lot of costs and put more ornaments on the tree may not be what we as a country should be endorsing.
Josh, you get the last word here.
Thanks. Well, I know there's a lot of excitement around the label's potential uses for third-party research, and a lot of the work that we all do and folks that dial in here are interested in, but I'll just bring it back to the real core use for consumers here, and that is the bill shock issue, for example, that Ryan talked about. At the end of the day, I hope that this label is really about making sure, that people know what they're paying for and that they get what they're paying for. And for too many people, that's not the case. And for a lot of consumers, right, when that doesn't happen, when you get a surprise bill, it's an annoyance, it's unexpected. But for very low income consumers, it's not just annoying, it's devastating. And that's really what we need to be getting back to. A lot of people struggle to afford their internet service because they simply cannot navigate these complex pricing schemes. They can't compare offerings if they have the luxury of actually having competition in their household. And that is really what I hope that whatever kind of regime that we have in data collection keeps front of mind, is making sure that a lot of these homes on the wrong side of the digital divide just have an easier time of navigating this market and just simply get bills that they can understand and afford.
Well, wonderful. Thanks for bringing it back to that. And that will have to be our last word. On behalf of our panelists, Josh Steger, Ryan Johnson, Steve Karan, and Sasha Meinrath, I'm Drew Clark. Broadband Breakfast will see you next Wednesday for a discussion of the future of rip and replace. Take care, everyone.